Please pray with me. God, teach us to see love for your creation as an extension of our love for you. Through your word and through our time together this morning, make us more of a loving presence in the world. Amen. I recently finished a book called The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, Bliss by David Bentley Hart. In this book, Hart essentially challenges what we might call a materialist or a naturalist understanding of the world. That's the idea that all that exists is what we can see or touch or feel or hear, and that the world is essentially something like a machine that's just chugging along, like all the parts are in place and it's just going along with no reason, no truth, nothing transcendent within or without it. Basically, what you see is what you get. And interestingly enough, last week, both Horacio and David Wheeler touched on this a little bit, Horacio in his sermon and David in his response. And so Hart is kind of challenging that idea. And so Hart appeals not only to Christianity, but all of what he calls the great theistic traditions to kind of discount this understanding of reality. And his argument is primarily rooted in who the great theistic traditions say God is. He says that most people who ascribe to this kind of naturalist, materialist understanding of the world think that the God that Christians and other theistic traditions believe in is essentially still part of the machine. Like if the world's a car, God's like the engine. It's really important, makes it all work, but God's still just part of the car. That God is a being among other beings. God's just the most powerful being. So Hart totally rejects this idea. And he says that other religions do as well. God is not a being among other beings, but God is the ground of all being. God is not filled with life. God is the source of all life. We talked about this a little bit last year in our series, I do not think that word means what you think it means, and when we talked about God the parent. So in that sermon, we talked about how God is both immanent, which means God is in the world, in everything, making everything, filling everything, and also God is transcendent. God isn't contained by any of it or even all of it together, but God is also somehow outside of it all, holding it all. God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, to quote Acts. So Hart says that the three realities in this book, being, consciousness, and bliss, are all point to God. They all point kind of beyond ourselves and beyond what we can see, and that this kind of mechanical, naturalist, materialist understanding of the world can't really give an account for where existence itself comes from, where being comes from, where consciousness and true happiness come from. But as you can tell, this book was a little bit heady and philosophical, and it took me months and months to read it. I put it down at one point, I had to pick it back up. But even though it was challenging, I really enjoyed the book. But many people might ask, what's the point in spending so much time reading a book like that? Sure, it's interesting for a few people and decidedly not interesting for a lot of other people. But in the world in which we live, surely there are more important things to focus on, more practical books to read, more pressing issues to concern ourselves with. For example, and I know it's like we all know these things, but we are still processing the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial. And we're caught somewhere between joy that justice has been served and also mourning that the event ever took place, and that even since George Floyd was killed, more Black and brown people have been killed. I don't even know if it's most recently anymore, but Adam Toledo is one of the most recent 13-year-old. We know there's been an uptick in mass shootings. We know that COVID still isn't over. We see houselessness all around our city. The list goes on. And as we focus today on creation, we think especially about the earth. We're reminded that all of this that we're talking about takes place within the environment in which we live. And as temperatures and sea levels both rise, as we hear about global warming and all this, many environmentalists are warning that we are nearing the point of no return. If we don't change the irresponsible way in which we have been engaging with creation, the consequences, we're told, will be devastating. So in light of all this stuff that is going on in our world, one might understandably ask if arguments like David Bentley Hart's about abstract metaphysical concepts are really where we should focus. I think that's a fair question, but I think that the answer is yes. Not that we all need to read thick, dense books or try and understand metaphysics or something like that, but the truth is, what we think about reality shapes how we engage with reality. How we see the world matters. Who we think God is matters. How we see ourselves, as we're going to explore the next few weeks in our sermon series, matters, right? The kind of narrative that we are told, or the one that we live into, or whatever, that shapes how we then engage with the rest of the world. And above all, as a congregation, we say that we don't want people to check their minds at the door when they come in, right? We want to engage critically. And so we should be thinking about these kind of things. Well, I finished Hart's book a week and a half ago, and I was already starting to think. I sat down to read it, and I was like, I'm finally going to finish this book. It's taking me forever. But I was already thinking about this Sunday's sermon, and I was kind of like, should I be working on my sermon, though, instead? But I was like, no, I want to finish this book. And so I was pleasantly surprised to see that Hart ends his whole argument right where we are today with talking about creation and why this all matters when it comes to how we engage with and understand the world. He says that a proper understanding of God, the book is called The Existence of God, leads to an unavoidable reverence and awe for the world that God has created and God continues to sustain. Ultimately, Hart says that if we had ascribed to this materialist, naturalist understanding of the world, this idea that all there is what we can experience with our five senses, the idea that there's no meaning, no transcendent source of being, then we will inevitably treat the world like a machine. If we think the world just functions like a machine, we will treat it like a machine. There will be nothing holy, nothing sacred, nothing mysterious about it. And there's no reason to respect and honor a machine with nothing holy, nothing sacred, or nothing mysterious about it. This is what Hart says. We ought to remember that the mechanical philosophy arose not just as a new prescription for the sciences, but also in association with a larger Western project of human mastery over the world. So at the same time, this idea that there's nothing spiritual, there's only what we can see and touch. At the same time that arose, so did this kind of new era of attempted human mastery over the world. The belief that nature is essentially machinery is a license not only to investigate its organic processes, but to disassemble, adjust, and use it as we see best. The early modern period was, after all, the great age of conquest of territory, conquest of less advanced peoples or races, even of nature itself. It was the age of nationalism, political absolutism, colonialism, the new imperialism, and incipient capitalism. So the connection that Hart is making is that the acceptance of this Western worldview, void of any kind of transcendence, any possibility of the divine, coincided with the rise of what he calls mastery, of conquest and colonialism. Because machines are created to serve us, right? We are constantly upgrading our machines, our iPhones, our cars, our computers, and we're always looking for the next new thing. And that which has become old, outdated, superfluous, whatever it is, we just throw it in the landfill. It doesn't have any value for us anymore. If our world is simply another machine, however complex it may be, then we'll inevitably come to think of it as something that exists just for us, something that we master, to use Hart's words, something that we are free to use and abuse. When we find parts of this great machine that don't serve our purposes, we will just dispose of them. And often it's even worse if we find something that is of value, because then we exploit it. We try and mine it till we can't mine anything else. We try and get as much of it as we can because it's valuable to us. There is no inherent divinity in nature if there is no such thing as the divine. There's no mystery if there is no meaning. There's nothing sacred if there's nothing spiritual. There's nothing holy if there's nothing other than the physical. And it's not just the inanimate objects that get exploited and abused. It's not just valuable stones and minerals and waterways and oil reserves. It's also living beings, plants and animals, and even people. If everything is an accident, if all that exists is material reality, then again, nothing is holy, nothing is sacred. As Hart says, it's no coincidence that the rise of a mechanistic view of the world coincided with the great age of conquest. For the most part, we continue to live today in this great age of conquest. While thankfully there are a growing number of voices sounding the alarm that we need to take care of our world, many others continue to pursue policies and practices that treat creation as nothing more than something to be exploited for their own ends. What is most distressing and most heartbreaking is how many of these people claim to be Christians, when this is anything but a Christian understanding of creation. When I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them, the psalmist asks. When he compares himself to the wonders of creation, it's not the world that becomes insignificant, it's him. He isn't puffed up with pride, but brought low with humility. He does go on to talk about the special place that people have over creation to take care of creation, but it comes first from this place of humility. And more than that, nature points to the one who created it. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. And this is essentially the argument of Hart's book, that our experiences, our very earthly, human, creaturely experiences point to that which is beyond it all, that which infuses it all, but also is not contained by it all. The one who stands both outside and inside, the one in whom we live and move and have our being, the Alpha and the Omega, Yahweh, I am that I am, God. Hart asserts again and again that the great theistic traditions have always seen God not as a being among other beings, as I said, not as another part of the machine, but as the source of all that is. And so to look for proof of God within the world as if God's just going to show up in nature like that, he said, is like reading the novel Anna Karenina and trying to find Leo Tolstoy in the book, like a character in the book. You read the book, you'll never find a character named Leo Tolstoy. And yet you cannot read the book without thinking of Leo Tolstoy. You might fall in love with the characters, you might like the plot, but in the back of your mind, you're always thinking, this is amazing writing. Like Leo Tolstoy was a really good author. The same is true for us with God. We come out of the mind of God, and there isn't any one place that we can just point. We can't find the page and say, oh, there's God right there. And yet the whole thing is like through and through the work of God. The same is true with creation. Now, of course, that analogy isn't perfect because Leo Tolstoy died, and we still read Anna Karenina. We don't think that would happen with God. We continue to live because God continues to live. We are dependent on God for every second of our lives. Well, I've shared with you before that my dad was a high school science teacher, and I've shared with you at some point, it's been a while now, but every year he would take students on a week-long science field trip, and they'd go to 4 locations over the course of 4 years. So if you went every year, you get to go to a different location. So they'd go to Zion National Park, Arches National Park, the Grand Canyon, and Death Valley. So if you went all 4 years, you could go to all those places for a week-long science field trip. When I was younger, before I was in high school, sometimes I would stay with friends or with my grandma, but sometimes I would go with them. And the last time that I went with the older kids before I was actually in high school myself was in 6th grade. And that trip was to Zion National Park. And it was kind of strange compared to the other times because I was getting closer to those kids' ages, even though they were all older than me. Like I related to them more than I did maybe in, say, 2nd grade. And also because I was older, I was like a little more independent from my parents. So I ended up hanging out with the high schoolers a lot more. And of course, I was drawn to like the cool older boys who like now my, mid-30s-year-old self is like, they were not cool. Like they were so arrogant and loud and like crass kind of, and they swore all the time, like every other word. And they knew they weren't supposed to swear around me because my dad not only was the teacher, but he was the teacher who led youth group out of his house once a week. So they were not supposed to, but they weren't great about kind of censoring themselves. They tried. But at this point in my life, I didn't really care about nature that much. I liked hiking, I liked climbing around on rocks, and I liked missing school for a week. So I went for those kind of reasons. And I got to hang out with like these cool older kids. That was really why I went. But the first evening that we arrived in Zion National Park, a group of the kids climbed up this big rock, like red rock mound, and watched the sunset on the Watchman, which is this huge, jagged sandstone. I guess it's like a mountain, but it just juts out like 2,500 feet from the canyon floor. So we were right by it, we're watching it, and the sun is setting on it. And they didn't know that I was behind them. And as it set and the rock turned this like fiery deep red, these high school boys just like started swearing, like just a string of obscenities, which I think is a kind of speechlessness when you haven't quite learned how to be quiet yet. It was like they were so taken by this, but they couldn't just sit in silence. They had to exclaim something. And so they were just saying a bunch of swear words, basically, until somebody was like, hey, look who's behind you. It's like the teacher's kid. But I think that these high school boys were so taken by the beauty. They were like enthralled by it. But I would say beyond just that one moment, they were catching a glimpse of like capital B beauty. They were catching a glimpse of the source of all beauty, we would say maybe, or the source of all goodness, the source of all truth. I think that they were tasting God a little bit in that moment. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims her handiwork. To see these I'm not trying to make any judgments about high schoolers in general, but I'm just talking about this group. To see these kind of immature, crass boys who made dirty jokes and loved to talk about how they got wasted every weekend, struck so deeply by the sun setting on this rock face, really impacted me as a little kid, or as a sixth grader, I guess. I still remember it. Obviously, I'm telling you about it now. And I don't think I ever looked at creation the same way again, because I was so shocked that they were so impacted themselves. As Christians, when we look at creation, we are not to see nature as some machine to be manipulated or some storehouse to be ransacked the way that so many today continue to see it. It is a living, breathing, thriving expression of God's love. It lives because God loves, just like we live because God lives. And in a sense, when it suffers, God suffers. We, tiny humans that we are given this humbling task of caring for this creation. And in a sense, when we care for creation, we care for the God who is present in it. It's springtime and the birds are out and the flowers are blooming. And when we hear the goldfinch sing in the early morning, it is God singing to us. When we smell the rhododendrons blooming, we catch the fragrance of God. When we run our hands along the tall meadow grass, we touch God. When we bring the marionberry to our lips, we taste God. And when we watch the sun set on a red cliff face, we glimpse the face of God. Because we believe in God, everything is sacred. Because we believe in God, everything is holy. Because we believe in God, nothing is without meaning. Amen.